Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this evening's FEDSA meetup, where Skulk and I are going to be talking about CSS layers. Thanks for joining us. Just a quick thing before we start, just to thank all our sponsors, NML, a software development company in Cape Town, who've sponsored us for many, many years. Also IO Digital, who've also been a great supporter of FEDSA over the years, and especially from Liesel, who runs all their operations, and then to Code Capsules, who sponsor our workshops, which we couldn't do without them, and Codespace Academy, who very kindly offer us a venue for whenever we run workshops. Speaking of which, there will be a community collab workshop coming up on the 9th of December. And the idea behind that is to build an open source website. And that will be run mostly by Skulk. So check out the meetup when it's published. That should happen shortly. Right. So I'm gonna hand over to Skulk now to just do an introduction for us on what CSS layers are and what they're not, and then I'll jump in after that, and we'll look at some examples. Cool. Over to you, Skulk.
Yes, I'm still busy frantically getting my slides in order on the side. So I was hoping you could keep the people occupied for a bit longer, but this is the nature of life. Damn it, Justin, you were too good. You were too good at your job. You were too concise.
I'm too polished now. I've just been doing it for too long. Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna have a moment of cool. Can you see my screen?
Yes, all good.
All right. Okay. And you can see the cake with the layers. I just want to also confirm.
Yes, all there.
Okay. All right. Okay. Because sometimes it shares, first world
I know.
problems. I have 3 monitors, and sometimes it
Yeah.
shares the wrong monitor. All right.
It's
So
not the most intuitive sharing interface. All right.
tell me about it. Okay. So cool. So what I'm going to do is, I think both of us are very kind of excited about CSS layers, and I've been actually wanting to do a talk on this for a very long time. And I kind of told Justin, "Hey, let's chat about CSS layers," and we thought we'd do it together because I think it's kind of something that requires a bit of unpacking, and also. Yeah, like I also think you should set your expectations correctly. A lot of people think CSS layers are something it's not. So if from my part of the talk, so the intro part, if there's only one thing you take away, that is that I'm going to cover what CSS layers are not. So it might not be what you think it is, but I'm also going to cover why, even if it's not what you think it is, it's really still super awesome. Okay, and I think then Justin is going to dive a bit into like kind of the technical side of things, some code demos and so forth. All right, so let's get started. And as with any talk about CSS, maybe even a talk about JavaScript and so forth as well, we need to acknowledge that CSS is in fact awesome. And I share this image quite a lot with some of my students and so forth. And like I can generally see when it's the first time they see this image, and some of them give a bit of a chuckle and so forth. And then I'm like, man, am I really that old? When I look at this image, I'm like, oh man, it takes me back to like a decade ago. So this is kind of like very much kind of coming off the era of CSS3, where all of a sudden you had this idea of content being agnostic from the actual styling, and that's kind of like the joke here. So all of a sudden you could have divs and stuff that didn't wrap around the content in the way that a table does and so forth. But anyway, CSS is in fact awesome. I write a lot of CSS day to day, but we also need to be honest that until it's not. Okay, so CSS is generally pretty awesome, but there are some places where it's like, phew, okay, it gets rough, it gets hairy. And one of those is related to what we're going to be talking about tonight. But there are 2 aspects to this kind of notion of global, everything being global in CSS. And I also just want to kind of set our expectations correctly in terms of what aspect of that CSS layers actually addresses. And I'll maybe just jump the gun a bit and say that CSS layers is not a replacement for CSS modules. Okay, I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. And if you are here hoping that, hey, I'm going to learn something about native CSS that's going to mean I don't have to use like post CSS anymore, I don't have to use BEM anymore, any of that stuff, this is probably not that talk. But I would still encourage you to stay, because I think even if that is not what CSS layers are, they're still amazing. I really like what CSS layers are doing, and I wish they were around, a couple of years ago, especially when things like OCSS and SMAX and all of that stuff were doing the rounds. Okay, but let's get into it. Whoops, time tracking. Oh, okay. We're not off to a great start. How do I even select that thing? Wait. Okay, I should probably put off my time tracker, but here we go. Oh, guys, this is just getting worse and worse the deeper I go. Let me just close that. And all right. Okay, so okay. All right. Okay, now we're in it. So what I want to show you guys is one of the problems of CSS. As mentioned, CSS in general is pretty great, but there are some rough edges where things get a bit hairy. And specifically in this case, I'm actually going to use an example of real code. So I just want to say the code that I'm going to show now is not some contrived random code that I actually just made up. It's actually from a real open source project out there. I don't want to name and shame things, even if like it's open source, even more so I don't want to do it, but I think it's important to note that this isn't just some made up crazy example to just prove a point. This is actual real code that's getting used out there by a lot of projects. It's an npm package that you can install. All right, so effectively, let's say you want to create like some type of stepper component. Okay, and this is how it usually goes. You start real nice, you get a nice name for it, stepper, and you create the class, and you're like, hey, let's add some basic background color. Let's actually add a bit of a text color and so forth. You maybe tweak the colors a bit. You're like, hey, you know what this really needs is a bit of a hover effect. And cool, we kind of add a bit of a hover. Let's say the opacity decreases a bit if you hover over it. And you're like, hey, this probably needs a disabled state as well. And I actually made a boo-boo. That should be a colon and not a dot. So it should actually be colon disabled, similar to hover. But yeah. So effectively, I need to update that when I go over these slides again. But effectively, let's add a disabled state. So we'll have a cursor that says not allowed. And we maybe set the background to like almost near invisible. All right, cool. Job done. We close that issue on GitHub. We do our pull request. The person looking at it says, looks good to me, and it gets merged. Cool. And we move on with our life. And a year passes. And a year later, we come back to this component because our project was wildly successful beyond our most ambitious dreams, and like we're still building this code base, and this code base has exploded just because this product was so successful. And we come back a year later, and this is how our CSS file looks that we wrote. Okay, and once again, I want to point out this is real code. This is real CSS out there. This is a real project that I copy and pasted this from. And this isn't because anyone is not good at their job. It's not because people are stupid. It's not because I would give people the benefit of the doubt and say it's not because people don't understand CSS. It's because we're solving problems in a localized manner, but like it's almost at death by 1,000 cuts. Every time you make something, you do a quick change here, a quick change there, and a year later, this is what you end up. And it's, effectively this. You might have seen this meme before, where it's like, okay, you just tweak it, and eventually it gets to a point where you don't get it to work anymore, and you start doing important, and you start doing this and that, and overriding media queries and inlining CSS and whatever. And at some point, it just gets out of control, and you have to like do 3 somersaults just to get it to actually do the thing you want it to do. Okay, that's a big problem. And I think anyone who says that's not a problem in CSS are out of touch with the realities that average developers face. I think like some people might say that who are like very, very like have a deep knowledge of CSS, and everything they do is very deliberate, and they always keep the architecture in mind. And I would also say people who think this is not a problem generally also don't work on very big teams. Like this is inevitable. All right. So And I really, really like this quote by Andreas Galante. And this is from his complete guide to CSS media queries. Actually, he says CSS is like a bear cub. It's cute, inoffensive, nice, easy to work with. You can pick it up, move it around, but as it grows, it will eat you alive. Okay, there we go. So it's like a little bear. Eventually, it grows up with enough time. It becomes big and ferocious, and you just wake up one day and the CSS is just out of control. And the other thing is, as well, is it's spoiler here, but code gets more complex. Code grows. It's almost unheard of that code actually becomes more straightforward the more features get added. Maybe if you really think the world of programmers and you really think everyone is this genius who can anticipate the future, I don't have enough belief in myself to know that I'm not going to add technical debt. Okay, every piece of code that I touch, I'm of the opinion I'm adding technical debt until I can actually come back and update it or make it better or incrementally move it to a better place. But effectively, all code grows, and you start out with this little small CSS file, and a year later, this is what you have. Okay, so what's the solution? Okay, luckily, computer science and programming in general, and people have been building software for long enough that there are some common solutions to this. The one is take that big bear and chop him up and into little small bears that are their own independent units and actually don't influence one another, and you control how they interact with one another. Okay, effectively, this is called encapsulation. So we can do this in JavaScript with modules and so forth. But I think I might be kind of going a bit too far ahead, but I think one of the key distinctions between CSS and JavaScript is that CSS, you can import files. So you can import one CSS file from another, and you can establish that dependency so that if you delete the root file, the dependent file no longer gets imported. But I think a key distinction here is there's no encapsulation. Okay, whereas in JavaScript with ES6 modules, you have encapsulation. So with JavaScript, you can control what gets exposed to the code base at large. With CSS, when you import something, it's literally like you take that piece of CSS and you put it in the place where that import is. It's almost like copy and paste it in there. Okay, so it's all global. Whereas with JavaScript, you have a bit more control over that. And we'll come back to this as well. That's one of the reasons why some people use JavaScript to control their CSS through CSS in JavaScript. Is because JavaScript gives us more tools for encapsulation and creating modules and stuff. But effectively, this idea of taking a big blob of code and splitting it up into smaller, more manageable pieces of code that you can deal with one at a time is as old as computer science itself. I really like this quote by Justin Meyer. I pronounce his surname very Afrikaans now for a moment. He's probably like, no, I'm Justin Meyer. But let's go with Justin Meyer. Okay, so effectively, so he's the guy behind JavaScript, MVC, and so forth. If you know what that is, man, how does it feel to be old like me? Okay, if you don't know what that is, appreciate your youth. So effectively, I really like his quote where he says, the secret to building large apps is to never build large apps. And that seems paradoxical, but the point here being that you kind of take your big piece of function, your big app, and you split it up into smaller little apps that talk to one another. Like you have these little units in your big app that effectively work as their own independent apps. You can run them completely on their own without everything around it. And and then that way you kind of use these as Lego blocks to eventually build something bigger. You don't take this big blob, or in programming you talk about this ball of mud. What's a ball of mud coding or whatever. And as you said, you assemble those back together. So instead you create these little bears and you just build this big bear out of all these little bears instead of this bad boy. All right. So, okay. And it's very similar to this. I don't know why this image has Barack Obama facing them off, but I don't know. I like the fact that it faces Barack Obama against one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses. So I don't know, but it is what it is. And but it's kind of the same thing. Would you rather fight one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? But I think in the case of encapsulation and modules and so forth, it's also different because you can fight one of these duck-sized horses one at a time, and you can take breaks in between. You can stop and continue tomorrow again. Okay, so like it really makes it easier to manage complexity at scale. And that's the thing about CSS. CSS is deceptively simple, but give it time, and yes, you get this little blob below. But once again, like if you think about the teddy bears, that's probably the exact same substance, but at the top it's just like made into these little units that you can easily interface with on their own without having to take into consideration what are all the other stuff that happens outside it. Okay, so as mentioned, this is called encapsulation. So in CSS, and now we're getting back to the cake layers thing, okay, because at some point I need to tie it back to cakes. Effectively, there have been attempts to do this in CSS. At this point, there is no native way to do this, but there are some ways people have been trying to get this type of behavior in CSS. And the reason I want to talk about this is because layers are somewhat related. And I think people often get confused by this idea of CSS modules, which is something different. But I think you need to understand CSS modules to understand actually what layers does, because you need to see it in relation to modules and modularization. And those aren't opposed. You can use them together, and I'll talk a bit about what might be some good use cases for the one and some good use cases for the other, and where you might want to use both. But effectively, what you're doing here is you have one big cake, and instead of one big cake, you have the same amount of dough, but you kind of split it up into little pieces that you can take by itself and move around. You can literally just focus on this little cupcake. Don't worry about the others and so forth. Okay. That is not what CSS layers are. Okay. But I think this is common enough. And, this is such a big pain point of CSS that when people hear CSS layers have been added and like they actually help with encapsulation, that this is the first thing that people's minds jump to. So I think that's why I had to do all that other discussion now, just to kind of prime you guys for what exactly encapsulation is. And this is one way of encapsulation. So once again, taking the same thing and making it into smaller little pieces of itself. Okay, this is more related to like components than what CSS layers are. But let's talk about them. So almost as old as time itself, one way to do this was by means of BEM. You might not have heard about BEM. BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. And effectively, it's a way to write your CSS. It has rules around how you write your selectors and what selectors you're allowed to use and so forth to create pseudo kind of pseudo encapsulation by means of namespacing things accordingly. And there are ways, so, like there's nothing still actually preventing you or someone else in your team from using the same selector name accidentally or whatever. But there are ways around this by using folders and files and stuff cleverly. But effectively, it's basically just an agreed upon way in which your entire team writes your CSS selectors as a means to get kind of fake encapsulation. Okay. But there's technically nothing that's doing the encapsulation. It's just by convention. Okay, you can read up a bit more about BEM if you want. There's also Suit CSS, which is kind of a permutation of BEM that's more suited for web apps, so things like that use React and Vue and so forth. It's also like Smax, which is kind of a precursor to it, but not exactly the same. Smax is more like kind of on the layer side of things and so forth. But there's this entire world of CSS methodologies. Okay, the other one that you probably know is post CSS. Okay, so getting CSS modules by means of post CSS. Okay, so I always appreciate like kind of the post CSS logo. It looks like it's some metal band or something. So if you don't know, the red thing on the top right is the post CSS logo, which is I appreciate that, especially in an era where we have all these tech logos where it's so slick and minimalist and so forth. We have this kind of cultic like sacrificial logo thing. All right, but that's CSS, post CSS. There are some specific libraries that help you do CSS modules by means of post CSS. So effectively, the first one was kind of one created by this organization called Evil Martians, which is like the best name ever for an organization. But they created this post CSS plugin that effectively, you might have seen this type of thing. Here's an example using React. But you can use this with basically anything, backend languages, PHP, whatever, anything where there's some type of processing of the HTML before it gets spit out. More often than not, that's some type of build process. Okay, but effectively what you do is, so this is an example. I think this works in Vite. I think it works in Next.js. A lot of these things out of the box. I think it works in Vue also out of the box, but effectively, well, if you're using the Vue CLI, but effectively, if you do .module CSS, you're effectively telling the build process, treat this as a CSS module. What you do then is you import your actual styles in your JavaScript, and then you use that object that it gives you to actually as class names, because it generates random numerical unique names and things. So you're using JavaScript to control what points to what, but the actual CSS that gets output is like just gibberish. Okay, but because it's gibberish, like the chances of it actually conflicting is almost in practice non-existent. Okay, I'll show an example of what this looks like when we get to like CSS and JS, which is the next one. So another way to do this is by means of CSS and JS, so style components, emotion, all those things. And this is kind of what it looks like. So this takes it a step further, and it says, given that you're already using JavaScript to control the selector names and stuff, why not just go all out and actually write your CSS in JavaScript? Okay, so I don't want to get into discussions whether that's a good idea, whether that's a bad idea. You can probably imagine, as with anything else in tech, the answer is a super unsatisfactory, it depends. Okay, it depends what you're building. But so depends on what you're building. This might be a good idea. You might be building something else where it's a bad idea. Okay, so effectively, it just completely removes all of the actual fiddling around with HTML and whatever, and it just like says like, cool, let's just write it straight up in JavaScript, and it manages all of this other stuff for us. And so this is what your class names would look like in something like style components or post CSS and so forth. So you manage all of that, your modules, because JavaScript has like encapsulation and all that stuff built in. It means that you just use that instead of CSS's global nature. So you just manage your CSS with JavaScript, that has all these things built in. Okay, last one I want to talk about super quickly. And remember, we're still talking about CSS modules, just so I can kind of define what are CSS modules, because I think you need to understand what CSS modules are to understand what layers are. Okay, so effectively, the most popular one is Tailwind. All right, across the board, like everyone should know Tailwind. I personally don't use Tailwind. I don't really like it, but that's completely subjective. Okay, and I think it's also it's not solving a specific problem that I have at this point. But I can definitely see the appeal of it. I can definitely see the appeal of it in a team that doesn't have very strong CSS skills in-house, and so forth. Yes, so I think a lot of people would say it sucks or whatever. I kind of like it. I like what it's doing, but I think it's a step in the right direction, but personally, it's not for me. And even if I were to do that kind of approach, I would actually prefer something like Uno CSS over Tailwind. So if you kind of like this approach, check out Uno as well. Uno is really great. But effectively, what this does is it says, how about if we don't even do our modules in CSS? No CSS, no JavaScript, whatever. Instead, we control everything through HTML, and we even do the encapsulation at a level lower. So instead of having these bears, we actually have all these random bear parts, like an arm, a leg, a nose, an ear, and then you compile it from this pre-existing stuff. But you're much more limited than you would be with other CSS modules, because you're working with this low-level predefined thing. So you can still do your like additional CSS on top of it, but then you still need to solve these problems. So if you want the CSS module aspect of it, or the encapsulation of it, you kind of more or less have to use like the low level things that it gives you. All right, cool. So what we've established that BEM, all those things, they are not related to CSS layers. Post CSS modules not related to CSS layers. CSS and JavaScript not related to CSS layers. Atomic CSS not. CSS layers are not going to replace any of these tools. Okay, these tools solve a very specific problem for which we don't have an actual built-in solution as a way to control encapsulation in CSS yet at the time of this recording. So, but like what CSS layers does, it does something different, and which is very closely related. But it's also still useful. It allows us to control what's called specificity. Okay, and you can control specificity at this moment, but as a side effect. Specificity isn't something in CSS that you can intentionally control. You control it as a side effect of what selectors you're using and whatever. Okay, so I think that's important to note. All right, so if we look at this cake and we say that, by means of encapsulation and a module type approach, we can actually get this, say, big cake and turn it into smaller cupcakes. And if we want to go as far as atomic CSS, we can have these tiny little cupcakes that we can even compose into bigger cupcakes and so forth and so forth. All right. None of these things are what CSS layers addresses. What CSS layers attempts to do. Okay, you've probably seen this one coming now for a mile. Also, probably didn't help that I used an image of a cake with layers in the initial slide. Okay. What CSS layers do, instead of dividing things vertically, okay, instead of vertically saying like split it up into, it divides that big piece of cake horizontally. So you don't reason about these things as little Lego blocks that you put in and can take out and so forth. Instead, you think about the code that gets applied in terms of phases, okay? The first layer gets applied, then the second layer gets applied, and the third layer, okay? And you might be like, okay, but why would you want to do this? There are lots of like great use cases, okay? So if you're building a web app, something like traditional CSS modules, probably useful. You probably want some type of widget that you can move around and use independently. If you're building something like Wikipedia, where you don't want to make every single link, every single like styling rule, every single italic thing a component on its own, and you just want to have this broad set of rules that apply to your CSS and gets applied based on the underlying HTML, this is a great approach. And you can also mix the two, where, for example, you might have something that's a bit more of a web app approach, where you have, something like Trello or Gmail or whatever, but you have different themes, okay? So a light theme and a dark theme. And so you might apply all these kind of module level things, but then you might have this layer that comes on afterwards that maybe overrides the base styles and maybe turns it into a dark theme or a light theme. Okay, so these aren't mutually exclusive. You can use both of them together. You just use them to achieve two different things, which, depending on what you're building, might not actually be of use, or depending on what you're building, might be of massive use. Okay, all right. So this isn't the first time that anyone has kind of this isn't the first time someone has. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words. Yeah, I'm trying to cram in as much as possible because I don't want to eat into Justin's time, because I'm really curious also to see what Justin has. But so effectively, this idea of layering your CSS is a pretty old approach, actually. Like I mentioned Smacks. It was quite a common thing in Smacks. It was quite a common thing in OCSS. And these, if you're wondering what these things are, they are actually like BEM basically, but whereas BEM is like very strong in terms of encapsulation and so forth, these kind of take a different approach in terms of, once again, your CSS as layers. Also, an approach where your CSS as layers might be really useful is if you have some type of backend like language, like PHP or Django or whatever, that's rendering your CSS, and you can't have that strict relationship relationship between markup and CSS and behavior that you would have in something like React or so forth. So a lot of times, even like some approaches this layers approach might work better with certain technology stacks. Okay, but effectively, this guy is Harry Roberts. I think it's Harry Roberts. Sure, I'm going to be very embarrassed. Yeah, I think his name's called Harry Roberts. He's the guy behind CSS Wizardry. Some of you might know him from CSS Wizardry.
He is Harry Roberts. Confirmed.
I was doubting myself there for a second, and I'm like, man, this is going to be on the internet. And Harry Roberts, or whatever the guy's name is going to email me, and he's like, you are such a dumbass. Okay. But okay, so Harry Roberts, I can confidently say now. Okay. So yeah, he's the guy behind CSS Wizardry, and you guys might know him from that. If you don't, check out his stuff. Guy is a flippin' genius. Okay, Eric Myers, Una Kravitz, who else? I'll probably afterwards think about 10 other people I could have named, but like there's this group of people that I really look to in terms of CSS, and he's probably up there in the top 3. Okay, but anyway, so he has this approach called ITCC. Okay, stands for inverted triangle CSS. Okay, I'm not going to go into it too much depth because I don't want to talk about ITCC, but I want to kind of say that like something like CSS layers is something that's like rocket fuel for something like ITCC. It can like really make ITCC powerful, whereas it wasn't necessarily as powerful. It's a good approach, but with layers, it's just like next level. Okay, so effectively, what he says is, you should do your styling in a layers-based principle, but inverted. So you should have more of the top level, more generic stuff, and less of the actual low level, super specific stuff. So he has, so you have specificity and explicitness kind of converging at the bottom, and then at the top you have kind of like general reach of your rules. Okay. If you didn't understand any of that, don't worry. This is not what this talk is about. Okay, but so let me show you an example. And I don't want to go into it in too much depth. I will share a link to the CSS file in the comments for the video. Just if you want to check it out, kind of reverse engineer it a bit, play around with it a bit. So here I have an implementation of CSS layers. Okay, and so effectively, let me just reload. Oh, I think it closes the results by default. Yes. Okay. So to kind of show you the behavior and kind of the reasoning, I'm going to try and go through this very quickly. Okay. So first level, you have your settings. Just disregard the layer stuff. I'm going to talk about it in a second. Let's just go through the actual CSS rules. Okay. So top level, you have your settings, and and that would just be like general things like variables or whatever. Then you have your I skip tools. Tools are really only a thing if you're using like SAS or any other type of tooling. If you're just writing plain CSS, the tools part, this is where your mixins and things would go. Next one is generic. So these are things like a universal selector and so forth, universal pseudo selectors and so forth. And then you have your elements, which are things like body, button and so forth, where you don't use like a class or whatever. You just start like generally across the board apply the rules to all of that type of thing. So this might be unordered lists or whatever. And you can probably see as we're going down this pyramid, and this is why it's kind of an inverted pyramid, is that the broadness of the CSS rules that we define actually get more narrow. So we start with kind of variables, then we start with just like universal selectors, then we get down to elements, and then on the next level you get into like classes, but specifically in this case, oh no, okay, let me open it on CodePen. I think it broke. I just wanted to keep this here on the side, so never mind, there we go. So I can reference it. Okay, but the next thing is objects. Okay, and so the difference between objects and components are a bit subjective, like now we're getting into that realm that you get with like atomic design, where it's like, is this an atom, is this a molecule, is this an organism? I don't know, like I have better things to do with my time than argue over whether something is an object or a component. But effectively the reasoning being that, sorry, this is the same code, it's just like dark mode. The reasoning being that things that are objects are generally more generic. Okay, so for example, a row. Okay, so in my CSS, in my HTML, so we have a row, we have a user action, we have an icon. These things are very generic structures. Like they're not specific components for a specific purpose. And the goal is usually like you override these very broad structures, general structures to create more specific things. So what I have over here is I have obviously my icons. I have a row, which is just a flex, puts things next together. And then I have something called user icon. And what's really cool about this, if you look at my HTML, you can see that this one is a user action. And this one is just a regular A tag. And this one is a button. So it's obviously agnostic of what the underlying HTML semantics is. You can use, so if I change this to a button, it shouldn't influence the styling. Okay. So there we go. Or I set it back to an A tag. Okay. So, but then obviously, so the basic behavior here is that, over here, if you hover over it, it has a bit of a opacity that gets filled. Same here. You might not see this on your screen. It depends on how the actual quality is. But then if you press it, it kind of does this little thing. And you'd actually be surprised by how concise the CSS is. It's less than 100 lines of CSS for all of this behavior, including this one. Okay. And that kind of speaks to the conciseness of something like ITCC or so forth. Whereas if you were to write this with BEM, you're probably looking at 300 lines of CSS maybe, which isn't a good or a bad thing. It's just shorter. Shorter can sometimes be bad. But then I have a very specific one. So I override my user action with something called favorite button. And the main thing that favorite button does, it turns everything inside it red. So the border, the color, and the stroke, and so forth. Okay, cool. So if I want to change this one to I can literally just go over here and I can say cfav button. And it's going to just apply those on my share as well. Cool, there you go. So you can think about, once again, these are layers that get applied at each stage. And then finally, you have your utilities, which I'm just using to create some space between these. So I didn't just add u left m and so forth. U left s for small. If you use Tailwind is effectively just everything is utilities. There's no distinction. Everything is just a utility. But in ITCC, and you'll also see that it's quite common to prefix these with O for objects, C for components, and U for utilities, so that when you're looking at it, you know what it is. And the other thing is utilities by default always actually have to be important because they're the final say. They should always override everything else. But here's the trick, actually. If you're using CSS layers, you don't need to do that anymore, because by definition, you get that from CSS layers by purely just describing things as layers. So what I want to quickly do is I want to show you what would happen if we removed all these layers. Okay, so layers don't add anything to your CSS. The CSS is still going to work. It doesn't add any styling. It doesn't do anything. It's literally just a way to control specificity. Okay, but the problem is if we remove this, then specificity is a side effect of the rules that we use. And to show you this, even though we keep the same order and everything, this still works, but hey, here's something going on. And even though we applied the C favorite fav button, when you hover over it, it's blue. Previously, it didn't when we hovered over it and we applied this. The reason being that is because this hover effect that's higher up has more specificity than this rule. Okay, so if we were to remove that, you see, cool, now it stays red, but now we've lost the hover effect on this. Okay, so there's an instance where we accidentally add specificity by just adding pseudo elements or whatever. And once again, this is very basic code. In real world projects, you probably have some nested stuff going on. You have some crazy selectors. So it's probably even worse in the real world. But so effectively what happens here is the specificity gets all mangled up. Okay. So the thing is as well, this is not insurmountable problem. You can do this by overwriting the specificity. So having a specific hover state as well that overrides the specificity of that hover state. So that works. Or what you can do is our good old friend important. You can add that naughty boy. Okay. So then it works. But the problem is now we've kind of gone for the nuclear option, and basically anything after this, or if someone for some reason actually makes this important again, now like the moment you start adding importance just to get stuff to work, like that's probably where things start going downhill. All right. But with CSS layers, we can be explicit in terms of the specificity. So if I just undo this and re-add all the layers, should work nicely. Okay. And then I'll talk a bit about what this actually does, and then I'll hand over to Justin. So effectively, you'll see here it works again. What we do, and this is a convention, I generally do this. You don't have to do this, but it's a good idea to just declare the order up front without assigning anything to it. Okay. If we don't do this, it would still create the order that the layers get applied in the order that they are declared. But it's just generally nice having it like this up front, having the entire stack, even if nothing's assigned to it, so you can see it up front. And also then if you move things around or whatever, or you can also go and add other things. So you can go back and you can say layer settings. So you can say, hey, put this in the settings layer. It's not one of those things where you go and you declare that layer and then you can't add anything to it again. So just having this up here is usually a good idea. So that when you do the CSS, you can just decide what layer it needs to be in without worrying about the order that you actually declare your layers, or declare the rules that get applied to layers. But effectively, all we're saying here is effectively apply everything in the settings layer. And then when that's done, that's done. Settings can no longer override anything. All right. Apply the generics layer. Cool. When all of that is applied, generics gets disregarded. It can no longer override anything. It's almost like a snapshot is taken of the CSS at that point. Elements and so forth. And every time a snapshot is taken and nothing, so there's no physical way something in settings can override object or generics can override component. Okay, so you can almost think about this. This is the worst example ever, but Z index, So Z index 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is always going to go on top of the thing that's before. No matter what, no matter if I go in here and I say that, let me find it. So like, let's say I want the old behavior back. Even if I go important, okay, even if I try and force this to override with important, it works. But that's because of a very interesting quirk. Before I just maybe want to reference that. So I think it was Miriam Suzanne. Suzanne, important CSS layers. There's a very interesting mechanic. Complete guide to CSS layers. I'll also add this to the comments. But it's interesting. Wait, how do I get to this? She has this entire. Oh, it's a repost from. It's on CSS Tricks actually. Where she kind of talks about all this low-level stuff, like really interesting stuff about CSS layers. And one of the quirks is that actually imports kind of get swapped. So if you do this, then I don't want to get into it. You can read, you can Google it, but imports no longer work the way you would expect them to work if you do CSS layers. Okay, but anyway, so if I remove that important, sorry, I said import, I meant important. There we go. All right. And that's basically the crux of it, is that these things get applied, and like almost once again, like this gets applied, and then it's almost as if those rules disappear and they can no longer influence anything. This gets applied, and it's almost like this disappears and it can no longer influence anything after that. So it applies it, and it takes a screenshot and it saves that, and the next set gets applied onto that, and the next set. So you have encapsulation, but you don't have encapsulation based on, separation of concerns, in which we would traditionally think about it in terms of this thing is a button, this thing is a widget, this thing is a drop down, but instead in terms of layers or phases that like the CSS should apply. And you can probably imagine, as I mentioned, you can use this in addition with CSS modules, because you can actually, let's look at an example. So you might even, I'm just going to write up here, you might even have, okay, so you have your base theme. Okay, just disregard all the stuff now below here. So you have your, let's say, your base layer. Then you have your actual theme. Okay, and that might be like a dark theme, a light theme, whatever, green, pink theme. And then you might even have user overrides. Okay, so, and then you can be sure that the base theme is never going to override the base layer is never going to override anything from the theme that gets applied on top of it, and the theme or the base is never going to override any of the user overrides that get applied on top of it. Okay, so unless you use important, then things kind of go off the rails a bit. But like, I hope this is the first time you're hearing that you should avoid important. If that is, yeah, kind of try and, what would be the word? Try and rehabilitate yourself and try and figure out ways to rely less on important, because important, you're just postponing a bigger problem for later. And everyone else that works on your code is going to hate you if you use important. Okay. Yeah, that was a very kind of simplistic, reductionistic version, but that's about it. All right. Okay. So this kind of was a high level overview of what are CSS layers, what are CSS modules, and why are layers not modules, and what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve with layers that CSS doesn't have at the moment. Geez, let me see if there are any questions, and let me also stop sharing my screen. Cool. Are there any questions? No, not. Okay. Yes. I spent a lot of time, like blood, sweat, and tears went into all those gifs and memes and stuff that I think that the content itself was like 5 minutes, and then it was like 2 hours of just finding the perfect memes and images. But yeah, all right. Let's not waste any more time. Justin, go. Tell us about CSS layers. Tell us about how exactly to use them and how they work.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Skulk, and thanks for that introduction. It was really great, explaining the kind of problems we're trying to solve here. And I'm very glad you spoke about modules as well and how those things are different. And I think we can also end off with what work is being done to actually solve the module problem as well. It doesn't exist yet, but it's in the works.
And I think a key distinction there is as well is, like, if you're looking at this from a very naive perspective, you might see these things of, okay, when that gets added, that's going to replace layers or whatever. Like, these are two separate things. Like, they solve separate problems, and you might use both at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, thanks for that, Scott, and thanks for that example as well. I'm just going to go through some of the technical things, and because there's a number of ways to use layers. There's no fixed method to define them, and I'll go through the various ways you can do that. I've just got some quick slides for that, and then I'll go into a real kind of example where we will look first at specificity and how that works, because this, as Skulk mentioned, is solving that problem where specificity, as he very nicely said, I think, as a byproduct, and how we can make specificity intentional with using CSS layers. Okay, so the first thing with layers, and Skulks mentioned this, is that the order matters. Yeah, so the order in which you include your layers is crucial. So the cascade, the C in CSS, is still going to work, and any layer that comes after another one is going to take precedence over one before that, unless you specify your layer order, as Skulk did at the top of his file. Yeah. So the basic structure for declaring this is that we use what is called the @layer rule. It's quite a confusing name, actually, because it belongs to the CSS properties that are called @rules. So technically, it's the @layer @rule, but we'll just refer to them as layers. Yeah. So the first thing we do is we just have our @layer. We give it a name. We open our curly braces, and then we just add whatever styles we want to within that. And those are then encapsulated within that base layer. And they will not leak out of that base layer. Anything that might come after that is going to take precedence over what we put in that particular base layer. So we could have the same class in our base layer and then have that class further down outside of the base layer. And we're going to inherit those properties, but also be able to overwrite some. If you've ever written button, button primary, button disabled, button hover, all as separate classes or attributes and things like that, we can go a long way to starting to solve those kinds of problems with those kinds of leaked styles. And I'm going to, in my example, I'm going to use a framework to show you, you know, the problems as soon as we have when we start looking at when we start using a framework, just because it's a good way to show how powerful layers can be, where we can get a whole lot of things for free, so to speak, but then be able to include our own elements at the same time. So that's the simple way to do it. We can also import. We can also use the import a function to import a CSS file and then name it as a layer. So we can add the layer function to an import, and we do this like this. Import and then a URL that then references the name of whatever that CSS file might be, and then the layer, and we give it a name. Okay, so that's another way to do it. And we can do these in a number of different ways. So I can use a layer statement to define layers, and I can format that as multiple or single lines or whatever I might want to do. And so these are the various ways we can do it. We saw that example from Skulk, at layer, base, typography, application. These are just made up terms. Don't take them as this is how you should name things. As we know, that is never the case. Right, so I could say, okay, at layer base typography application, that's going to say base has the lowest level of specificity here. Typography is second and application is third. Right. So I could now go and actually write all my application layer styles at the top of my CSS file, and then have my typography after that and my base after that, and essentially invert what we would normally call the cascade. Yeah, because that because the layer order that we define is going to define the specificity. So this is a nice way we can define our layers in one place, in our layer order in one location at the top of their styles, and then we can add styles later via the block method, by the import method, just by referencing the same layer name. Yeah. So here, as I said, base would have the lowest priority, followed by typography, and followed by application. Now, the spec is very particular about the order of import. Once you add a layer after an import, any use of import after that layer will be invalid and won't be loaded. Yeah, so you need to bear that in mind. Yeah. Okay, if we don't, you must group your imports. If I don't specify in my original at layer priority a name for an import, it's not going to be imported. Okay, very, very important. Yeah. So we want to group them before we create any more layers. Yeah. We can also have nested layers. So in our declared layers, we can actually create nesting. So here we could say in our components layer, let's create a layer for our button, our accordion, our slider. We're sort of getting to scoping there a little bit, but not really. I don't want to say that because that's not really what we're doing here. We are just talking about specificity. Yeah, this is in no way now scoped to our button component or anything like that. Yeah, it's again just specificity. And here again, this would then go in that particular order according to the cascade. But we could also say something like at layer components dot button, and then within that put some styles. So we can nest these. This can make things a little bit easier to maintain. If you've got a really large style, kind of global type app style sheet or something like that, it makes maintaining that a little bit easier. Right, so import an actual example might look like this, where we could say import URL path to reset.css layer reset, import URL path to bootstrap.min.css layer bootstrap. Yeah. And at the top of our import there, that's actually a header that at import at the top. It's just being, the slide's just not rendering nicely. That's not meant to be code. Sorry. Misleading. It should not be.
Well, it's
Yeah, it's
valid
just being rendered.
CSS,
Yeah, it
is it
is.
not? Yeah,
No, it's
it's
not, because I'm
minified.
not. No, I mean this part here. Yeah, that's just a heading. The code fence is fine. Sorry.
Oh, I see what you mean. I thought you
Yeah,
meant the
yeah.
wrapping
I
of
didn't.
layer.
Yeah, no. I didn't mean
I'm
to
not gonna
add
lie,
a.
that bugs the hell out of me.
Yeah, it's
I'm like,
annoying. It's annoying.
no.
Right. So we can import entire style sheets into new layers. Yeah, we don't have to declare all our layers within the same style sheet. And we've always had the import directive in CSS. Um, it kind of it kind of ran out of fashion because of connections, old connections, and HTTP1, and having to do all these fetches from the server and so on. But that's not an issue anymore. So I would use them where applicable. So we can import these entire style sheets, and then we can override things in that without worrying about how those external style sheets are going to target our elements, because we're encapsulating them in that layer. Right. So just a little few kind of things here. So if I have layered versus unlayered, if I say at layer typography H1 color blue, and then after that I do H1 color green, H1 will always be green. Yeah. So let's remember that we're outside of the layer now. So we need to be careful when we're writing things that unlayered styles are always more powerful than layered ones. Yeah. So even if we switched this order and we had our H1 color green above our typography layer, and then we would go according to our normal cascade, surely this is going to take precedence. It's not. An unlayered style will always take precedence over a layered style. And layers don't add priority the same way important does. Yeah. Instead, they remove priority in relation to unlayered styles. So something always to remember here. If something is unlayered, it has priority. So the specificity algorithm still applies, but now it applies within each layer. Okay, so something to remember there. We're still talking about specificity. We're still talking about the specificity algorithm, but now it looks for conflicts within the layer itself. Yeah. So some things to remember. Important is a weird case, as Skulk mentioned, because the specificity now lives within the layer. Importanting something in the layer isn't necessarily going to give you the result that you might expect. Yeah, because of the way that unlayered and layered styles now work
Yeah.
in
And I
terms
also
of
think, like,
importance.
yeah, for anyone who wants to read up a bit more about that, like, the reason being that important ended up being a bit of a hack. It was never
Yes,
meant to be like nuclear mode override. Like, it
exactly.
was actually meant to be a like something that's part of the way that the browser like renders CSS, and who gets to decide what styles get applied. I think it's related to a bit more of an antiquated view of what the web actually ended up being. But
Absolutely,
the
yes.
reality is, this is the underlying logic that CSS is based on. And we can't just go like, oh, this logic doesn't make sense anymore, so we're just going
Yeah,
to completely not follow it. At the end of the day, you
exactly.
still, all the things in your system need to make sense. You can't just go, we're going to just ignore the system. So
Yeah,
that's a side effect of that. But yeah, it's
yeah,
super interesting stuff. I
definitely.
encourage everyone to check it out. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, if you the this whole thing around important and layers is quite confusing the first time you start to work with it. There's a really good article on Smashing Magazine. I'll share it with everyone as well, by Stephanie Eccles, on layers. Stephanie, who we had on one of our YouTube conversations a while back, does amazing CSS work. Someone to add to the list Skulk had. So she's got a really good article on layers on Smashing Magazine, where I pretty much learned everything I know about them from. And she explains really carefully and clearly how this whole importance dilemma works within layers. Yeah. So important has its place. I mean, Scott, you mentioned that Harry Roberts says, your utility styles important them and so on. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there
But
you
with
not
layers, you don't. With layers, you don't need
yeah,
to do that
you
anymore
don't need to, no.
because you can decide what gets applied last. But I think
Exactly. Yeah.
that rule was purely because you didn't have the
Have that
behavior
ability.
in
Yeah.
CSS. So it's effectively, once again, it's the same as setting your Z index to 999999999. That's fine if you know there's never going to be anything above
Yeah.
that. But
And
if
there
you
will
do
be
that,
inevitably.
yeah, but with utilities, not. With utilities, you
Well, no,
can
sure,
say,
sure.
by
Yeah, yeah,
definition, there will never be anything above a utility.
yeah.
But yes,
True.
as you mentioned, like that's not generally how important is. I wanted to say used, but
Yeah. Yeah.
misused. Yeah.
I was just going to say, in that case, important is used like preemptively, whereas often important is used to fix something that's gone wrong. And that's where we're getting into trouble with important. If you're saying, okay, I know this should always be display inline block, like an image, for example, or whatever you might do. That's fine, and you'll see that in lots of frameworks. Yeah. But when you're going, why is this color red? I need it to be green, and you hack an important on the end. That's when you're misusing that. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, that's another discussion. Right. Okay. Do we have any questions so far? Shall I? No. Okay. I'm going to move on to the examples.
I just
Um,
quickly, I just quickly want to mention. Oh, I actually don't have the power to do this. So that maybe you can click at that 7.1 CSS architecture. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So it used to be kind of a very big thing with like SAS. In terms of the 7 types of things that I can't even remember what it is, was really big when I was doing WordPress back in the day. But effectively, you have your mixins, you have your whatever. So there's 7 different types of CSS files that get compiled into your final output. So
yes.
yeah, like I think like that comment was in a reference to the ITC thing, which kind of follows very kind of similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's along the same lines of there's different types of things that you style
Yeah.
and different types
It
of
is quite
rules.
similar.
Not
Yes.
all rules are the same. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It is quite similar. Shall I zoom in here a bit?
please do. I want to read all that lorem ipsum in its
It's
glory.
it's from some science fiction thing. Okay. So again, here I'm going to do something a little bit contrived, just because of the nature of a talk and explaining these concepts at quite a high level. So I've just made this really, really simple a bit of HTML. We've really just got a couple of paragraphs, and then we've got a couple of buttons. And on those buttons, I have added some bootstrap classes, and we'll see what's going to happen. Yeah.
I just want to quickly say I'm so glad you're bringing in Bootstrap because
Good.
I think layers are the perfect tool for Bootstrap, Foundation,
Mm.
Bulma,
Any of those
Materialize.
frameworks. Yeah.
I almost feel like layers are a bit late. I think like they would have been much more useful in the heyday of this tooling. It
Yes,
feels like
exactly. Yeah.
nowadays these tools have kind of receded a bit, like
A little
atomic
bit. Yeah.
CSS. Yes, but and also pro tip, I think like just I recommend you switch off your Copilot. Whenever I'm doing a demo, I
Oof.
really get angry because Copilot tends to give the solutions while I'm typing and I'm trying to explain what the solution is going to be. So just a little heads up.
Why
As
won't
someone
Okay, I'm just going to disable
Let's see how it goes. But like as
extension,
someone who
actually.
does a lot of teaching, a lot of times I'm busy explaining something and then Copilot just auto completes it for me. And I'm like, no man, Copilot, stop it. It's trying to be too helpful. Again.
Okay, I just need to reload.
It's fine. Like, let's not prematurely optimize here. If it's not going to be, well, there you go.
No, you never know. But you're absolutely right.
Like Justin is scared what it's going to actually autocomplete because it's obviously
Yeah.
trained on
What
your
have I been
existing.
working on? I've been
Yeah.
writing lots of PHP. Yeah.
Like before we proceed, I just want to like mention like when I've written a code comment once where I was like typing it and I started typing. Please note that this function and autocomplete and Copilot autocompleted it is a temporary hack and should be replaced at some point. I'm like, screw you, Copilot! Don't judge my code. But yeah, like that was pretty great.
Okay. All right. So we've just got, so here I've got this style sheet. I've just included some things and they're all commented out at the moment. And the first thing I just wanted to look at was specificity. So I'm just going to undo do this. Actually, before we do that, you can see here what's being rendered here, and we'll look at this in the browser now as well. Like there's nothing here, right? No styles being applied by me, okay? Only user agent styles. And if we look at this in the browser, we can see here, wherever we go and select an element, it's going to say user agent style sheet. Okay, so this is just being pulled in by the browser. And that's like the top level of styles that are being pulled into whatever we're creating. And they have the lowest specificity of everything. Yeah. The browser says, we're going to do all this, but you can overwrite almost all of these. Things like replaced elements, images, forms, inputs, slightly different, but anything related to any kind of sectioning elements and any textual elements, any inline elements, we have a lot of control over. If we go to computed and we go to show all, you can see here, these are all disabled. I can't make any changes to them. This is what the browser is now applying, in this case, to our section tag.
And it's also worth noting that sometimes in browsers they apply different user agent styles, which is where you get stuff like normalized CSS and so forth. So something like normalized CSS kind of overrides the parts where browsers differ a bit. Yeah.
Puts everything on the same footing, more or less, or where it matters.
I think it's less an issue nowadays. I don't use normalize.
It is less of an issue, but no, I don't use normalize either. I've got a really minimal reset, which I'm actually going to show what happens when we apply that.
Yeah. But once again, layers would have been a great thing for something like normalization and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah. So you'll see here, I actually have a reset here. It's a very simple one. It just adds, your box sizing, changes the line height, inherits fonts on elements that don't, breaks words on textual elements, and then, you can see I do a lot of next work. So that's for next. Don't worry about it. Right. So if I go to my style sheet here and I just undo, I'm just going to uncomment that. You can see now that's immediately changed. Yeah. So we can see we are now pulling that in and we're getting some changes here. You'll see the line height in particular is changing. And our buttons are inheriting our font, the line height, and so on. Okay, so we pull in that reset. If we now go to the browser and we go to our section and we go to our P. Sorry, I just need to save that. I didn't save it. To refresh here. Typical. Sorry. There we go. I'm going to inspect that, and we can see here now our reset. We're now getting styles from our reset, but our user agent is still applying all the other styles that the user agent wishes to apply. Right. Now, if I go, now I've just got this global one. I'm going to apply that, and you'll see here now we're just setting up some things that might be global, like adding margins to the bottom of our headers, changing the font size, and then just adding some spacing and blah, 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 blah. Okay. And now we have this global style sheet that is now appearing, and we're getting styles from that as well. Okay. And this is all just imported into the same style sheet. Okay, I'm going to leave Bootstrap for now because we want to deal with Bootstrap via layers. Yeah. So I'm going to come in here. I'm just going to look at a little bit of specificity so we can see how we solve these problems. Okay, so there are our paragraphs now. Now they're all just beautiful colors. Okay, so what I've done here is I've gone, okay, P, color, coral. And that is now this color here. And we can see here that paragraph is just a P. It has no attributes, no class, no ID. Yeah. And I can put that there, but now only that one is coral because this one has a class of green and this one has an ID of blue. Now, IDs are more specific than classes. So even though my ID precedes my my class, it's still going to be applied. Yeah. So if I had class green, ID blue, this would still be blue no matter where in the cascade I'm putting that. Yeah. Right. Now we can do some layers here. So let's say we want a layer and we want to specify our layer for text and our layer for paragraph. Yeah. So we're going to do that. And then within this, I'm just going to remove that. Whoops. Okay, we're going to say layer text, blue, make it the color blue, green, make it the color green. Great. Okay, nothing's changed. Yeah, we've just moved those into a layer. Yeah.
It might be worth just zooming in a little bit slightly if you can.
How's that?
Cool. Yeah, I have a pretty big monitor, but I would imagine it kind of might be a bit
Okay.
like not great. Like maybe also change the layout because it currently has the thing where it puts it like to take up the entire screen, even if it on the streaming. Yeah. Yes.
There we go. Thank you. Cool. Okay. So I've removed these just for now. I've created my layer text. Text is first. I've got an ID and I've got a class in there. I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to remove this particular comment. And now all my paragraphs are coral. Yeah. So even though I've got an ID here and a class here, and here I just have an HTML element, this now has greater specificity than those two, which should have more specificity. And that's because I've now gone and put them in layers. Yeah. So that's a very simple example, but it shows you the power of how layers work. If I went here and I said, oh, okay, no, let's change the order. We're going to go paragraph text. Now we are back to where we were with our particular items, even though paragraph is coming after text in our cascade. Yeah. So we can easily change. We can easily go and start to create specificity intentionally, rather as a byproduct of how we structure things. Yeah. Okay. Now that's a contrived example of sorts, but I think it indicates quite well how this works in terms of specificity. And let's remember that in terms of specificity, and this is an important thing to always remember, our user agent styles, and I'm just going to go back to my browser here, our user agent styles have the lowest specificity. Our author styles will then have the next specificity. Our author important styles would come after that. Okay. And our layers would come after that. So let's remember how that always works in terms of specificity. Now, we've got these layers, and if we look in our inspector, if I go to green, you'll see here layer text color green. So layer paragraph is being overwritten. So very nicely, our dev tools are now naming our layers for us. And we can also go and click this little icon here in our dev tools next to our pseudo elements, etc. And here it'll tell us we've got two implicit outer layers, and what is the specificity of those? Paragraph and text, and that should match what we have here. So if I switch these around again, I'm going to go text and paragraph. We're back to Coral. And if we now select this, you can see text and paragraph have switched around. So the browser's helping us here. And if I go here, layer paragraph, I click on that, it's going to show me exactly where that lives in my particular layer elements. Yeah. So this handy little button here will tell us that, and or clicking on one of our layers in the actual style panel will also show that. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of these because we don't really need them for now. So I'm just going to delete those, and we can get rid of these as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import Bootstrap. Right, so you can see straight away that a lot of things have changed now. And you can see that we've got specificity now being overwritten by a number of things. So Bootstrap's coming after all of that, and by the normal kind of workings of the cascade, that's now going to overwrite anything we might have in global and reset. So if I go to Bootstrap, you can see it's an enormous file. This is minified, etc. There's a lot there. If you've ever wrestled with Bootstrap before, or any kind of framework, you know how hard it is to overwrite things. So here now, if we go to our paragraph, we can see we've got things user agent and so on. Now Bootstrap's already overwriting our body stuff. So you can see here we've got a font declaration, text size, adjust, and that's all we have. And Bootstrap's now bringing in all of this stuff, and this is going to start overriding all our things. Our reset is overridden by Bootstrap, even though, by Bootstrap having its own, etc. Margin 0, and the only thing that's not being overwritten here now is this, where we're adding a margin bottom of 1.5 rem, and that's because we have a much higher specificity. You see here we have a specificity of 2 because we're using our is selector, whereas here we have a specificity of 1 because Bootstrap is just using an HTML attribute. All right. Okay, so what can we do about this? Well, what we can do is we can open our... So we can go back to our code here, and we can start to add Bootstrap as a layer. So instead of always having Bootstrap just imported and overriding anything, we can rather go and specify it as a layer. So we can say that instead of doing it this way, what we're going to do is at the top of our style sheet, we're going to say at import, and we're going to say Bootstrap, and then we're going to say, sorry, why is that giving me, what am I doing? Sorry. At layer, Bootstrap, and then we're going to do reset, and then we're going to do global.
Sure. Look at that hacker language, huh? Rasset.
Right. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say at sorry, we're just going to modify these, and we're going to say at import that, and that is layer reset. We had autocomplete anyway, and this is layer global, and this is layer.
It might also be worth just noting that, like you probably saw on CSS trick, not CSS tricks, CodePen as well, that when I applied layers, the code highlighting got a bit weird.
Yeah,
And it's because layers are pretty new-ish. So some tools or themes or whatever might not have like kind of styling rules that take them into account. So that's just an FYI to
that's
keep in
right.
mind.
Yeah, you'll
Yes,
see that
and
on
so
a
that might
couple of
also be the case
things.
here as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's not going to have autocomplete or things like that for everything that you might want, and it might actually even say you're making an error. Yeah, the linting tools in particular. Yeah, right.
But yeah, just give it time. Like
Yeah,
these things will catch up. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so we've set that up. Great. So now we saying our order. Okay, so we want to use our reset because Bootstrap comes with its own, etc. But we rather want to just use some basic stuff that we've set up. So we don't want to lose our line height to Bootstrap's added one. We don't want to use our break word, and we still want to have things like this. Yeah. So if we go back to our styles, now you can see, okay, why aren't these being applied? Typical.
Do you want them? Because I see the order of global and reset is different at the top.
It shouldn't make
Uh,
a difference, but let's just see.
should global not come before? No, at the top. Should global not come before?
No,
No.
that's
Reset should come
global. It
before
would be
global.
like app or
Okay.
whatever.
And
Yeah,
and you obviously want Bootstrap to have the lowest specificity.
that's right.
Yeah, it might just be a case of reloading. Ugh, nothing like live debugging.
Of course. I
Yeah,
mean, it
but
seems to
like,
be it seems to be correct because if I look at my order, Bootstrap is being overwritten.
hmm.
But in that case, it's because I'm importing it here. But if I put it here, it's also being overwritten. So but now I'm just not getting my layer stuff in the.
It might have something to do with the hot module replacement,
Yeah,
because it doesn't reload the page. It just swaps things with WebSockets. So it might be worth just doing like a hard refresh.
I have.
Oh, you have. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. I don't know. That's why you can actually, like my web components video that I did. That's why you can rewatch it and then in clear as daylight later on see what you did wrong and be like, oh man, I was such an idiot. And you can rewatch it every now and then and just feel ashamed again.
I just feel like an idiot.
Yeah, and have people correct you in the comments. Yeah.
Okay, let me just add this and we'll see what's happening. So that is being applied over and above Bootstrap. You'll see we do have things that are missing here, but it's not giving us our layer. And I definitely haven't done anything wrong.
And that is in fact what gets imported via link tag into the HTML. This
Yep.
style.css file.
Yeah,
Is
that's
it?
right.
Yeah. 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 Oh, interesting.
But what's
Then,
interesting is that it's working.
yes.
It's the dev tools are not playing along.
Yeah. Interesting. And once again, it might just be a quirk of, once again, like a hot module replacement.
Might
Maybe if you
well be.
actually deploy it to like an actual like HTTP server or something instead of local host, it might
Yeah,
work. So it might
I
very
think
well just be because, once again, like, so hot module replacement just swaps things in and out of memory instead of actually loading it full on every time. Um, which is why sometimes things like service workers or so forth are a pain to get working with hot module replacement.
absolute pain. Yeah, see, look, I mean, it is working, right? Because if I swap those here, now Bootstrap is taking precedence. Yeah, my
Yeah,
global is not being applied.
yeah.
Yeah,
So it might just be
so
like
it's,
it might be some shenanigans related
yeah, it's just
to,
something in the. You see there, it's
yeah,
working again. And if we look at our buttons, the display properties and everything that I'm adding from my layer are being applied and overwriting the Bootstrap ones, even though that is being imported after. Um,
yeah. Well, if it works, don't question why.
I won't.
Uh, yeah. Also, just a quick heads up. I might disappear purely due to
Yeah.
load
So
shedding.
yeah,
So, uh,
well, Scott, I
yeah.
think yeah, we're almost at 8, so maybe
Okay.
we should just wrap it up.
But
I
no, like, I'm happy for you to continue. I just want to say that's not me being rude. Um, okay, there you go. Honestly, real talk. I actually wish people would do more live debugging. My students, like the sessions that have been the most valuable to them, have been the ones where things don't work and they actually get an insight into, cool, how do I kind of go about systematically trying to figure out, and I think that's something that's very lacking from a lot of like live coding tutorials and whatever. Like it doesn't, like, no one ever teaches you how to approach debugging. But yeah, so Justin, I'm
yeah,
just trying to
someone
spin it in some way. There you go. But like, yeah, no. So Justin deliberately did that as a solid for you guys. You can thank him later.
yeah, yeah, show you that it
getting
happens
a
to everyone,
getting
and we
getting
shouldn't be scared of it.
getting yeah, getting a view into the absolute genius that is how Justin's brain works. But yeah, no, I think we've kind of covered it. I think
Yeah, it
the
was just
rest is very easy to just like, but it's just dev tools. Like everything else worked out.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um.
yeah.
So
Um,
yeah.
so I've actually got a repo for that, just
Yes.
with more in-depth examples. I'll share that with
Yes.
everyone. We'll
Yes.
put it in the YouTube description.
Yes. Yeah.
And then there was just one other thing I wanted to mention before we go, and that
Mm.
is just to go all the way back to what you were saying about modules and how those are that this is not that, which is
Yes.
absolutely correct. However,
Yes.
there is a proposal in the works. It's already
Mm.
supported in Chrome. It's called Scope. It's
Yes.
another part of the at rules. It's at Scope.
Yes.
Firefox and WebKit, i.e. Safari,
Mm.
are working on implementing it.
Mm.
But so it's not usable yet. I think there's like a 48%
Mm.
support across usage. But yeah,
Mm.
so Scope will be coming. We don't know when. You
Mm.
can already start playing around with it in Chrome or WebKit
Mm.
or Chromium. Sorry, not WebKit. Chromium-based browsers.
Mm.
And that is exactly what we are now using things
Yes.
like style components and CSS modules and so on
Yes.
for.
Yes.
That's going to go
Yeah.
into vanilla CSS. Yeah,
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 and there's a lot of tooling. Like, I don't know if you've ever like looked at, if you're familiar with pandas, or sorry,
yes,
Panda CSS. So
Panda. Yeah,
Panda like is built on top of a lot of this stuff, and that, like,
yeah,
Panda's doing some super exciting stuff. And I
very
think also
exciting.
Panda is a really nice attempt at, because there are some major drawbacks to CSS and JS. We need to be real there. There's a great developer experience. but there are some drawbacks, and depending on what you're building, you might be able to stomach those drawbacks or not. If you're
Yeah.
building a dashboard for internal use at a company, millisecond page loads, not going to be the end of the world. If you're building an e-commerce store, something loading 10 milliseconds slower, now you're actually seeing a drop in
You're losing
usage.
money.
If you're
Yeah.
building some random tool that someone uses at a company to calculate something or whatever, not the end of the world. I think it's also worth noting that I've only recently started using layers, exactly for the reason you mentioned about scope, is that it dropped. It's like a year and a half old now, is it not? Or how
It's
old is
been
layers now?
Chromium support for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
but it's also like it's one of those things where you want like proper propagation of it
Yeah.
through the browser
Just
landscape, because the same with scope, there's no way to progressively enhance it. A lot of
none
other things like
whatsoever.
a lot of other things like grid and whatever, you can progressively enhance. So everyone get a base level experience, and then the added stuff on top of that. Unfortunately, because things like scope and layers are actually a way of understanding what you're writing. Like it's either your CSS works or it's completely broken. So that's just the caveat there, specifically with like the scope stuff. Like I wouldn't start using it in production
No.
when it drops. Layers to me is at a good point now. I'm happy to use layers where there's like a 0.4% of users that maybe get a broken site. I don't know. Like depends on what you're building. If you're building
Yeah.
something for like a government department, probably need to support i5. If you're building something for tech startups or whatever, someone tries to access that thing with Internet Explorer. It's like, but how do you even survive? How do you even
Yeah.
use Gmail or whatever? So yeah, those
Yeah.
are just
Agree.
considerations to take into account.
Yeah.
But
Very much
yeah,
so.
so
Yeah.
yeah, in terms of browser support for layers, yeah,
Go
it's
for it.
pretty
Yeah.
solid. I would use it. Scope,
And also,
give it some
don't
time.
don't don't shy away from using it in your React application, or because
Yes.
you might be using a CSS and JS solution. You don't need to
Mhm.
throw that away. This can
Yes.
enhance how you use that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Another thing as well is I think it's also worth touching on polyfills.
Yeah.
There is a polyfill for CSS layers. I haven't used it. I don't know how adequate it is. Justin, do you have experience with it?
I haven't used it. No.
Okay, but there is a polyfill. I can't speak to how well it actually polyfills it. But if you want like some backward support, probably you can get the full on thing in post CSS, because it can probably just like turn that at layers for you into actual garbled selectors and whatever to get the same behavior. It's not
Yeah.
adding any behavior to the browser that it doesn't exist in the browser anymore. It's just a specific syntax to
Mhm.
write your rules like in a better way. So by
Yeah.
some transpilation or post CSS, you can probably get 100% polyfilling, like all the way
Yeah.
back to like the start
Yeah.
of CSS. So yeah, I
A lot
don't
of
see a
these new
reason.
things are are
Mm,
are, are leveraging
yes,
which has like full support. So
yes,
they
yeah,
very much come out of is the being and under the hood. They're
yes,
really just leveraging is, yeah.
yes,
Nesting,
yeah. It's
container
yeah,
queries, uh,
yeah,
which are other things that are all part of this part of
mm,
CSS that we're getting now to write
yeah.
CSS, to make writing CSS easier.
This has been a
Nesting, container
great year for
queries,
CSS.
yeah, scope,
It's been amazing year for
layers,
CSS.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
This
But
has kind of been the ES6 era of CSS. No, legit. Like it's been an amazing. I've
absolutely, yeah,
I've really enjoyed writing vanilla CSS
yeah,
nowadays, like I haven't in years.
yeah,
Yeah. Like
mm,
if you've been using SAS or whatever for a long time now, I would encourage you to give vanilla CSS like CSS variables, all that stuff a try. It's actually like I
yeah.
really enjoy writing plain CSS nowadays. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you
Um,
just, I mean, a lot of people use SAS primarily variables nesting.
mm,
That's in plain
yeah.
CSS now.
Yes,
Yeah,
and variables in plain CSS is more powerful
much
than
more.
SAS, because the variables in CSS you can actually swap out at runtime,
Exactly.
which you can't do with SAS.
Yeah.
But anyway, I don't want to
Anyway, yeah, we should go.
my power is going to go off. Awesome. Thanks everyone for
Thanks,
joining.
everyone.
This was
Yeah.
really great. I hope this was
Sorry
helpful.
for the hiccups,
Please,
but yeah.
if you have we need to cut this a bit short, but if you have any questions, post them in the comments. I'll have a look at the comments every now and then. I'll maybe respond. Justin, you can also just respond there as well on the actual video. It should go up tomorrow. Yes, awesome, cool, guys. Have a great evening and take care.
Thanks, God. Bye.